Hello, good evening. Welcome to this Farm Advisory Service webinar. My name's Alec Perry. I am a consultant here in the SAC office at Auchincruive. Tonight, I'm joined by my colleagues John Baddeley, Robin Walker, and Daniel Stout, and we are going to be looking at plugging the protein gap in Scotland and using legumes to do that. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we're going to do tonight. Hopefully we're going to finish around about 9 o'clock, depending on the questions and the feedback that we get from you guys. Like I say, we have two presentations here from John and Robin, and then we're going to break out into an open Q&A style session. So please store up your questions, put them in the chat. We've got Daniel here. He's going to be monitoring the chat. He'll distribute questions to John and Robin as we go. We will leave questions till the end though, so just hold on and keep your questions until the end. And this is part one of a two-part series. So obviously we're just going into the basic payment application window right now. We hope to have part two of the series coming into June and July. So watch out for that. Okay, and without further ado, I'm going to pass you guys over to John, who's going to take away in the first presentation.
Right, hopefully you've got that. Could you just confirm that?
Yep.
Yeah.
All
Cheers,
good,
guys.
yeah.
Right, okay, good evening. My name's John Baddeley. I'm based at the SRUC campus in Aberdeen, up in the northeast, along with my colleague Robin Walker, who will be speaking to you after this. So between us, we're going to talk about different ways that we can introduce more legumes into cropping systems. I'm going to kick off with a look more at the forage end of things and look a little bit about the rules and regulations as well. And then Robin will follow in with a more arable-based approach afterwards. Okay, so by way of introduction then, what I'll be talking to you about tonight are a few definitions and regulations, the kind of dull, dry stuff at the start, get that out of the way. Then look at why we should be interested in these crops. Why are they rising up the agenda? You know, we're seeing more and more about this type of thing. And then go through some examples, because I find that an awful lot of farmers and growers, they may have heard of some of these things, but they're not that familiar with them. And certainly in terms of growing them in a Scottish context, may be a bit wary. So we'll go through some of those. Okay. So definitions then, well, we get all sorts of different terms bandied around for things such as cover crops, catch crops, green manures. Different people use them to mean the same thing, different things. It's all quite a confusing area. What I'm going to talk about tonight is what I'm going to call green manures, although other people will quite validly call them cover crops and possibly even catch crops. So let's not get too worried about that. It is a big confusing area. Just be aware that these terms do get bandied around, but they don't have precise definitions. For the purposes of tonight, I'm going to talk about nitrogen fixing green manures, so ones that are containing legumes, and I'm going to define that as meaning, define green manure, that is, as something which is grown primarily to benefit soil fertility. So this is soil fertility in its kind of big holistic sense. It's not necessarily just confined to nutrients. It's about the whole package. So the amount of organic matter there, the amount of microbiological and macrobiological activity. So just the whole package of what's going on in the soil to make it more fertile. So green manures being grown primarily to benefit that longer term, big scale soil fertility. The rules and regulations bit, well, it's all been blown out of the water recently. We thought we knew where we were. We had a nice little research program all based on CAT regulations, and they of course have gone now. But just to look at the sort of things that we can grow as nitrogen fixing green manures, they can include the classic forage species, such as the clovers, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. They can also include grain legumes, So we can be talking about peas and beans here. I'll mention them maybe briefly in passing, but as I say, Robin will cover that in more detail later. And they can also, of course, include mixtures of these legumes with non-legumes, such as grass clover mixes, which are a common feature of grasslands in Scotland. So rules and regulations then, we've seen a lot of headlines like this about the fact that the cap greening measures are going to be scrapped. However, it's maybe not that clear cut. If you start looking below the surface, our Environment Secretary has said that the so-called greening requirements have added little to our environmental efforts. There doesn't seem to be, I would say, a lot of evidence maybe to support that statement, but that is a statement that's been made about them, and that we are now beginning the move towards new environmental land management scheme, the ELM scheme. So talking here primarily, I think, about what will be going on in England, but still worth bearing in mind. So ditching the greening requirements in favour of a new environmental scheme, but they also say that that new scheme will reward farmers for delivering public goods such as tree and hedge planting, creating or restoring habitats for wildlife. Well, all of those are currently part of the greening regs, so there doesn't seem to be a lot of change there. And the NFU have said that many of the elements under greening are protected by other legislation anyway. So there we're looking at things covered under GEEK and the statutory management requirements. So it's likely that greening in some form or another is going to be with us for some time. It might just change its name. Going on to a more Scottish perspective, Scotland has a very ambitious aim to be net zero in its greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. So this vision was set out in the climate change plan, published 3 years ago now. And that has just been updated. There's an update to it that came out, I think, in December. And that's updating it in the light of the recent pandemic. It's available on the Scottish Government website, and I'd encourage you to at least have a look at the executive summary for that, because it sets out quite an interesting and ambitious path for Scotland over the next 20 to 30 years. And the third sentence, I think, in that summary is, as Scotland emerges from COVID-19, we have a chance to rebuild our economy in a way that delivers a greener, fairer and more equal society. So this is big scale stuff. This is quite impressive in terms of its breadth. It's talking about societal change and that being greener, more inclusive. And it then goes on to state what role agriculture has to play in delivering that aim. And it's quite a fundamental one. Just to give you some examples of that, this is a vision of what agriculture is going to look like in Scotland in 2032, which is only 11 years away. So one of the outcomes is that it's going to be more productive, it's going to be sustainable, and it's going to significantly contribute towards delivering Scotland's climate change and wider environmental outcomes. And the way that that will be achieved is a review of existing cap greening. So note here, not like the English statement about ditching cap greening, and it will extend the requirement of farmers to undertake environmental actions. So that, if anything, is broadening the scope of the greening regs. And that will involve emission reduction, sustainable food production, and improving biodiversity. Now, you might think I'm kind of swerving a bit off topic here, but green manures, cover crops, that sort of thing, have very obvious contributions to make to achieving these aims. And if we go a little bit further on through the report to outcome 3, so that's going to look at nitrogen emissions, including from nitrogen fertilizers, and they will have fallen through a combination of improved understanding, efficiency, and improved soil conditions. So we're getting onto the kind of terms that we're more familiar with now. We're talking about what the soil's like and so on. And specifically, they say that we're going to investigate the benefits and barriers of leguminous crops in rotations. So here we are now, we're getting on to the real kind of topics that we want to talk about tonight. So leguminous crops, that's exactly what I'm about to talk about. And importantly here, I think, in rotation. So we're not just talking about bunging a few legumes in, we're on about how they work in actually a real farming system. So some quite interesting things in this report. As I say, it's available online and well worth at least a read of the summary. Okay, so how can we grow these green manures? What are the different ways that we can do it? Well, there's quite a few. So the one that's probably more familiar to a lot of people are long-term green manures, also termed leys. So these are things that are typically in the ground for at least 2 or 3 years. And at the moment, these are usually grass legume mixtures, usually grass clover. We can have overwinter green manures. Now, these probably are more typically what you might call a catch crop, something they're designed to reduce nitrogen losses from the system. They don't tend to include legumes because legumes don't establish that well over winter as a rule. So their major use is to minimize nitrogen leaching, and they're not really particularly what I'll be talking about today. We have summer green manures. So these are ones sown in spring and left in the ground either for a few months and incorporated maybe August, September time before a winter crop goes in, or they could be left over winter as well and then incorporated the following spring. And these are usually legume based. And the aim of growing these is to provide a nitrogen boost to the system in a rotation. Of course, in an organic farming system, this is the principal way that fertility is built in the system. So this kind of approach is fundamental in organic farming. And then we have what can loosely be termed intercropping. Robin will be talking about intercropping after me. But for the purposes of this, I'm talking more about leys that are established by undersowing them into a preceding cereal crop. So putting down, say, a crop of spring barley with the intention of following it with, say, grass clover. But instead of sowing that in the autumn when establishment might be questionable, we can undersow it into the spring barley, which then gives our green manure a longer growth period and can help weed control and establishment. So those are some ways we can grow green manures. Just like to highlight a few general considerations that we might have when we're taking this sort of approach. So we need to think about our sowing dates relative to the sowing dates of cash crops. These things are probably going to take second place relative to a cash crop. We want to look at rotational limitations. So here I'm thinking about especially disease, maybe. We have to think carefully about what's in our green manure and whether that's going to have any disease implications for the cash crops. We have to think about the cost. You know, these things aren't necessarily very expensive, but they're also not free. So we have to buy the seed, and there is some management, even if that's minimal. You know, that might involve no more than broadcasting the seed and giving it a quick roll, or it might be slightly more elaborate. We have to think about how we might get rid of this when we don't want it anymore. You know, it's not a cash crop that's going to naturally be harvested. So is that going to be chemical? Are we going to rely on things like frost killing it off? Are we going to graze it down? Are we going to plough it in? It needs to be thought about. And we also need to think about the issue of volunteers. So what's the potential for some of these green manures to be volunteers in a following crop, and possibly quite a difficult volunteer to control? So those are some general considerations that we need to take into account. If we go on now to look more specifically about green manures and what they can do for us. The advantages can be that they'll undoubtedly add organic matter to the soil. That in turn leads to an increase in soil biological activity, with a consequential improvement in soil structure. We probably have some kind of increase in nutrient cycling in the soil. The extra organic matter is going to help us reduce leaching losses. It's effectively going to make the soil a bit stickier, chemically speaking, so it holds on to those nutrients a bit better. They can suppress weeds if managed correctly. They can reduce certain pest and disease problems. And in addition, nitrogen fixing green manures, which is kind of what I'm talking about today, so we're containing nitrogen fixing legumes, are going to increase the soil nitrogen levels and therefore decrease the need for bagged nitrogen fertilizer, which has all sorts of cost and pollution savings, both in terms of buying the fertilizer in the first place, applying it to the land, and also in terms of not needing as much fertilizer to be produced, because producing fertilizer is quite a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. So these are some of the routes by which you can now see, back to that the climate change report, about some of the routes that are being taken to try and reduce the impact by improving things like nitrogen supply from legumes. Okay, that's all very well and good in theory. How does it kind of translate into practice? How much nitrogen is actually fixed by a legume? Well, it's a very good question, and a lot of people scratch their heads a lot about it. One of the better sources of data probably is a DEFRA project that was run by ADAS a few years ago now, specifically for organic farming. And that came out with this figure. So what we've got here along the bottom is the kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year fixed by various legumes. Those are the kind of pale yellow bars, and the orange bars are the amount of nitrogen left in the ground after harvest. So you can see that always the amount fixed is greater than the amount left behind. That you would probably expect. And then we have different uses as well. So we have a few up here that have been cut for silage. Then we move down to grazed, then a few grain crops, and a bit of cut and mulch down here. And you can see their estimates for nitrogen fixation for things like Lucerne and red clover are anywhere from sort of 150 up to 450, 500 kilos of N per hectare per year. That's a lot of nitrogen. Some people think these figures are maybe a bit on the high side. I would say certainly in a Scottish situation, you could maybe reduce these by 30 to 50% without too much trouble. But we're still talking of ending up somewhere in this area. So in the, say, 100 to 200 kilos of N per hectare per year, which is, you know, the right ballpark to provide enough fertilizer to grow a decent crop. So yes, these things can actually provide enough nitrogen. However, there are a few caveats, as there always are. So where there are advantages, there are also disadvantages. So there are potential disadvantages to green manuring, which we should be aware of. There's things like the cost of seed and extra cultivations. Touched on that before. We might lose opportunities for cash cropping. We might end up with extra work at our busiest times of year. We can exacerbate pest and disease problems. This is something called a green bridge, where you can imagine a situation where over winter, if there's nothing but stubble left in a field, that's not a particularly nice habitat for anything to try and live in through the winter. Whereas if we have a nice living green cover, then that's quite a good environment for bugs and beasties to live in. So we can get some carryover of pests and diseases that way. Volunteers, so the potential for green manures to become weeds themselves, I've mentioned already. And crucially, the fixed nitrogen might not be available when the crops need it. So although that previous figure had quite high levels of nitrogen being fixed, as we know, if we're using bagged nitrogen fertilizer, it's crucial that we apply that to the crop when it needs it most, so at the time of peak nitrogen demand. That's easy to do if we're tipping it out of a bag onto a field. It's much less easy to do if we're relying on the decay of crop residues, gradually releasing nitrogen. So that is one of the things that some of these projects are looking at, is how we can manipulate that nitrogen supply to be more available when the crop actually needs it. There are also wider benefits of growing more legumes in our systems. So we generally, they help drive increased forage production through their nitrogen fixation. They grow big, and also anything like grass with them also grows bigger. They tend to have high nutritive value, so they have a high protein content, which means that there's generally a high voluntary intake of them by stock. You know, the stock want to eat them. That in turn results in higher livestock performance. And we also get wider biodiversity benefits. So one of the more obvious ones of these that's in the news a lot at the moment are pollinators. So a lot of pollinators are very fond of legume flowers. We have a honeybee here, but it's not just honeybees, it's all sorts of bees, hoverflies, other pollinators as well, can benefit from this. So that's a bit about how we might go about growing green manures, the different sorts of uses they might have, and roughly how much nitrogen they fix. What legumes actually are available to us? How can we do this? You know, we've got the old workhorses, so we've got things that we're familiar with. So white clover, something like that. So it's low growing, so it can be quite good at smothering some weeds. And crucially, it's very tolerant of sheep grazing due to its low creeping growth habit. It tolerates really close grazing by sheep. So a very useful component of mixtures there. And yeah, reasonable levels of nitrogen fixation. Red clover, the other legume that probably most of you are quite familiar with. Really good for nitrogen fixation, can fix very large quantities of nitrogen and put on large amounts of biomass. It does, however, have growing points which are quite a long way up off the soil surface, so it's not great under close grazing, but very good if managed properly and topped, so good for silage. I won't dwell too much on the red and white clover, because, as I say, I think people are probably quite familiar with those. But it is worth bearing in mind other clovers are available. This is crimson clover, spectacular when it's in flower. And its main feature is it establishes much faster than red and white clover. Really fast grower in the spring, and then tends to flower quite early in the season. So great for pollinator resource, but also crucially very good at smothering those early season weeds that can sometimes get ahead of red or white clover. So quite a useful component of systems, this one. There are quite a few other species of clover as well that are becoming more available from seed merchants. Sainfoin is another legume that can be used. I won't dwell on this too much either. For hundreds of years, this was the main fertility building crop across most of the south of England. It almost disappeared in the mid-80s, but it's making a bit of a comeback now. It's probably the highest quality forage legume, but crucially for us, it's not good on cool, wet, acidic soils. So in trials that we did, this was one of the few plants in a whole plot that actually did well. The same things were being grown down on chalk soils in the south of England, and they had massive biomass from them. So yeah, it's good on sort of high pH soils in warm climates, so not great for Scottish conditions. What is good for Scottish conditions, though, is this beastie, Birdsfoot Trefoil. It's a native wild plant. You'll often see it in hedgerows and on bits of waste ground and things. It has a kind of it's not a very substantial plant. It kind of has a trailing growth form. It kind of goes on and on a bit. And it takes a bit of time to get going. But once it does get going, it can be very good. So it can out-yield clovers once it's actually got itself established. So if this is going to be in the ground long enough to do something for you, it can be a very good option. It's really good if it's grown with grasses for support, to give it some kind of scaffolding to hold it up, and that really helps boost its production. And it does really well on poor quality land. So if you're struggling on land that's maybe a bit acid, a bit damp, won't really support clover very well, this can be a really good option. And just to emphasize how tough and hardy this is right on the north coast of Unst, which is the northernmost island in Shetland, sort of looking up towards the Arctic off in the distance there. And here you've got trefoil growing quite happily wild right next to the beach, covered in sea spray. So it's a tough beastie. Going to the other extreme, something which is massively productive is vetch. This is becoming more common, I think, now. If you're not familiar with it, I describe it often as it's a bit like a pea on steroids. It's like a giant pea that doesn't know when to stop. It just kind of keeps on going. This sward here is probably about 1/2 meter high, very dense. Weeds don't have a chance really. You might get the odd thing like a thistle getting through, but pretty much it just smothers everything. And it's indeterminate growth form, so it just keeps on going right until winter sort of finally knocks it back a bit, but very, very productive. So very high yielding. It's got a large seed about the size of a small pea, so it establishes very quickly from that. Very good at weed suppressing, and probably of all the legumes, it's probably the most winter hardy. We've sown it right up to the end of October in Aberdeenshire, and it's still established. Not great, but it has, whereas clover, you wouldn't have a hope. And it does come back in the spring. So if you want an overwinter legume, it's quite a good choice. So it can be sown late. It's best mixed with cereals, again, a bit like trefoil, something to hold it up off the ground. And in that case, we can get massive levels of biomass. We've been doing some trials growing it with rye, because rye is quite robust. And we've been getting dry matter yields of like 30 tons per hectare off it. And that's with no nitrogen fertilizer. It can be grazed if you're careful, but it's best really cut for silage. Okay, and Lucerne. It's the last one I'm going to talk about. There's not much of a scale here, but here we're on about 1/2 meter again, height for Lucerne. So it's quite tall, quite stiff stems, and it's also known as alfalfa. So back in the days that I can barely remember, when I had an office to go into, on my bookshelf, I have a book on forage legumes from the 1920s. And that tells me quite categorically that Lucerne will not grow on soil of pH less than 6.2. It won't grow in Britain north of Hull, and it won't grow on wet soil. So for quite a few years now, we've grown Lucerne very successfully in Aberdeenshire on soils which have all been, I think, pretty much less than 6, certainly well north of Hull, and not the driest of soils either. So I don't know whether it's modern varieties are more tolerant of conditions, but it's certainly done pretty well for us. So Lucerne can be very high yielding, particularly if it's in the ground for a few years. It develops a massive deep tap root that punches down through sorts of plough pans or anything like that and helps recirculate nutrients and deepen the soil profile. It also makes it very drought tolerant. It's got a very high D value and high protein levels. It's probably just about second to Sainfoin in terms of forage quality. There's more and more of it being grown, certainly in England now, for silage use. So its use is spreading in Britain. It's widely grown worldwide. So there's something like 13 million hectares worldwide. A lot of Canadian systems grow this. They really like it in Canada. So it is definitely worth thinking about, or at least having a trial with it. Quite a promising newcomer. You do need to inoculate it to make sure it's got the right bacteria to fix nitrogen, but that's taken care of. It just comes with the seed when you buy it, so it's really not an issue. The last thing I want to touch on, I've been talking here about different straits of legumes, but one of the things we've done quite a lot of work on in the last few years, but don't have time to show you the results from, is growing mixtures of these. So rather than growing single species, we've been looking at growing combinations. Here's a picture of red clover, black medic, which is a bit like trefoil, it kind of trails. So we have the red clover here. This is the black medic with its yellow flowers kind of trailing through the middle, and then Lucerne here to give it the whole thing a bit of height and structure. So very three-dimensional mixture here, and these are much more productive than growing single species. The reasons for that are that because the roots and shoots both have very different architectures. You know, one will be very have big flat leaves low down. Others, like Lucerne, will stick up a lot into the air and capture different bits of light and so on. So they use resources differently. Having non-legumes mixed with legumes increases the amount of nitrogen fixed by the legume. Just that very fact of having several different species gives us inbuilt redundancy into the system. So if the conditions, say in the spring, don't favour one species, then the others might be okay. So that helps generate some degree of yield stability and resilience to poor weather conditions. And this has now been established pretty much on a worldwide scale, where lots of intercropping systems are used all over the world, that these sort of mixtures yield typically 20 to 40% higher than growing a single crop. Mixtures might actually be better suited for some purposes. So if we're looking at generating high protein silage mixes, then mixtures might be better in the first place. And also they have the potential to provide these greater biodiversity benefits, which, as we've seen, are going to be more important going forward in terms of realizing payments. So for delivering biodiversity benefits. So an obvious one of that is if you've got two different species which flower at different times, we've got a longer flowering period. So there we go, greater biodiversity benefits straight away. I just wanted to kind of finish on that, introducing the concept of mixtures, because that Robin will very much focus on that in his talk. He'll have a lot more about mixtures. So just to summarize what I've been talking about, it's worth remembering there's a wide range of forage legumes in addition to the sort of typical red and white clover, and they all bring something different to the party. Most of the good seed merchants now have a lot of good information on their websites about these different species. They're effectively a source of free nitrogen, if you like, and as we've seen, we can actually supply considerable amounts. It's not supplying the odd 10 kilos here or there, it is actually into 3 figures. There are many potential benefits beyond just the nitrogen. So stock wanting to eat it, biodiversity, so on, lots of benefits. Mixing them with non-legumes generally enhances these benefits. And a couple of thank yous. The main collaborators of this work have been Robin Walker, who you're about to see, and Lorna Cole, who you're not going to see. And the funders for this mostly have been the Scottish Government RESAS funds and the Mains of Lauriston Trust. So thank you, and I'll hand you back to Alec.
That's great. Thanks very much, John. That was really good. Before we go on to Robin, can I just ask Robin that you start sharing your screen? Can I just remind everybody that you know, please do put in your questions as we go, and we'll be sure to answer them once we come to the live Q&A. If not, it'll just be myself that's quizzing Robin and John. Okay. Can
you see?
Good to go, Robin? Yep, good to go.
You can hear me as well. That's good. So I'm kind of following on from John. I'm going to be talking much more about kind of arable type legumes or grain legumes, and focusing a bit more on protein and some of the quality issues that are maybe linked to that. So, but there's a definite link from what he's just said about the use of mixtures and things like that. But there's also sole crops that we will be talking about, and most of this is based around various research projects that we've had over the last, I don't know, 12 years or something. Oops, why is that? Okay. So obviously, one of the key things we're looking at, I'm predominantly talking about livestock use here rather than necessarily for human use. And obviously, one of the key things is livestock production systems depend on our ability to provide sufficient quantities and quality of metabolizable energy and nutrients. And in terms of the protein supply, often it's the first limiting aspect in terms of livestock use, and it's also quite often one of the most expensive ingredients as well. So that's one of the kind of key areas we're going to be interested in. Obviously, if you're looking at monogastrics, so the pigs, poultry and salmon, that would be in concentrates. So you could be looking at you know, key products there, and the high quality protein is all directly from the diet. And then you've got some of the other things, a bit more like John was talking about early on, with the forages where you're using the rumen and perhaps supplementing with concentrates as well. But in many cases, protein crops are often legumes. I mean, I know there are other aspects you could use, for example, kind of cake from after the pressing of rapeseed and things like that. But if you're talking about a specific protein crop or what are known as protein crops, quite often they're legumes of one form or another. So if we're looking at kind of protein concentrate production, if we look at the map here, myself and John are actually both based up here, and this is where the majority of our trials are based. But I think one of our colleagues, Paul Hargreaves, is actually on the call tonight as well. He's got some work going down at Crichton as well. So we've actually got some dual aspects going on in terms of demonstration plots. So I've got a couple of slides later on about that. But the majority of the work that I'm going to be talking about is really based here, just around Aberdeen. So we're trying to demonstrate potential. One of the things we're trying to do, trying to encourage farmers to think about growing more of their own protein rather than necessarily buying in soybean or soybean meal type stuff. And in terms of the typical Scottish protein crops, they are minor. I mean, beans, peas, and lupins are the kind of the three main ones. If you discount the kind of the clovers or grass clover systems, but beans, peas, and lupins are the kind of the main grain proteins which you would typically associate with Scotland, but they are not grown in particularly large areas. And some of the other work we've looked at more unusual protein crops. And when we have tried soya a couple of times with not very much success, but lentils is something that we have tried for about 4 or 5 years, and actually it's worked better than we anticipated. So again, some of the data that I'll show later on includes that. So demonstration alternative practice as well. So not only we're growing these as sole crops, apart from the lentils, which we always grow as an intercrop, but we're also looking at how they grow in terms of an intercrop with a cereal. And majority of the cases we've used spring barley, so these are spring crops. So I'll talk a bit about a couple of years of experiments. So we had the same treatments each year, the 2018 and 2019. As a replicated block trial, so we've got statistical strength in the data. The crops were spring sown, and we grew them as either sole crops, so grown on their own, or as an intercrop or a crop mixture. So the kind of the key protein crops that we were looking at. So we had field beans, which is probably what most people would perhaps be familiar with, and that was grown either with or without spring barley. The variety we tended to use was Fuego, and the barley variety was Westminster. I know that's been around a while, but it does seem to kind of work quite well in a mixture. Yes, and particularly in the low input system. So we grew the beans either as a sole crop, and this 40 and this 60, and this 60 and this 40 is basically the ratio of a full seed rate. So we either had 40% of the full bean seed rate and 60% of the barley, or the other way around. Similarly, we had that with peas as well. So peas with or without spring barley, and the same kind of ratios, either sole crop or these two ratios here. Again, Westminster was the common denominator there, and we used 0-4 peas, which we found worked quite well in an intercrop. We looked at lupins as well, again, with or without spring barley, and the same ratios. Part of the reason for having the higher grain proportion of grain legume in there was to try and, obviously we're trying to push the protein levels up. So we know if you can grow these on their own, you do get high levels, but there is that element of inconsistency between seasons. So that's part of the reason we're trying the intercrop. And going on to the kind of more unusual, well, barley people will know, but that was our control crop. But the more unusual types were the lentils. So it's a kind of pui, sort of a green type lentil. We had that at 2 sowing rates, a high rate and a low rate. This particular variety was called Anicia, and it was recommended to, well, we originally got the seed from a Swedish colleague who'd been grown in the south of Sweden, and they grew it with oats, so we did as well, because to be fair, nobody had really been growing lentils much at all in Scotland, so we were taking their advice on that. There's a few people tried it, I think, over the last couple of years, and a company called Hodmedod's is interested in that as well. But that's the kind of general setup. So we obviously knew some of the agronomy in terms of things like peas and beans and lupins to some extent. We didn't know very much about the lentils, so suggested agronomy there was from the Swedish compatriots. We did grow these under very low input conditions. It wasn't necessarily organic, but it wasn't far off. And we were keen to have a relatively low fertility site, just to see what, so we could push the nitrogen fixing side of things. But we did add P and K, so I think that was about 60 kilos of P2O5 and K2O each, but no nitrogen. Sowing date tended to be April, it depended on the season, but aiming for around about mid-April. And then there was a yield and quality sampling regime. And we looked at multi-use options. One of the reasons for this was people are a bit wary about growing grain legumes on their own because of, there are a few horror stories about complete disasters and this kind of thing, and just variability in the crop. So we actually looked at using silage or kind of whole crop type silage as one option. So if the season was looking a bit ropey, when you kind of got through, midway through the summer, we're looking at the option of silage, but we were also trying to aim for combinable grain at the end. And this just happens to be one of these little micro silage bags that we made. So basically we grew our plots, and then we had a metre wide mower. We went across the plots, and from that metre wide by 2 metre width of the plot, we made these microsilage bags, which were then got tested for analysis. And when we went through to combining, we did similar with the grain, but that was using a plot combine. So these are some pictures of the crops early on. So this just happens to be spring beans and spring barley. So again, you can see the 100% bean on the here early on, 60% bean, 40% barley, 40% bean, 60% barley. And the other slides later on will be much the same for the other crops, but later on in the year, that's what they look like. So the sole bean crop and one of the mixtures. Looking at the peas, 100% peas, and then we've got the 2 different mixes. So this is the one with more peas in it, and this is the one with slightly less peas in it. And this is it later on in the year. And then the lupins, we didn't really have a huge amount of success with lupins. They're definitely more tricky to grow than the other 2 grain legumes. But again, we've got 100% lupin and then the 2 different rates. And this is later in the year. And then these are the lentils. So if you haven't seen lentils, this is what they look like. And you can see the oats. And the oats were there specifically as a support crop because it is quite lentils are quite a low growing kind of, they got little kind of spidery bits which kind of help climb up the oats, but the oats are there really as a scaffold, a support to kind of keep them off the ground because they do have a tendency to go flat. And this is later on in the season again. So we've got the lower rate of lentils in here and the slightly higher rate in here. So silage was the first kind of option we looked at. This is again 2 years. So the yellow columns are from 2018, which you have to remember was a very, very dry season, very dry year. And 2019 was a little bit more kind of normalized in terms of the weather. And across the bottom here, you can see the different crops or crop combinations. So we have barley on its own, pea, 2 different rates. That's the high pea, low barley, low pea, high barley, etc. And through the beans, the lupins, and then we've got the lentils, low and high. So the kind of silage yields we were getting was somewhere in the region of kind of 6 tons per hectare dry matter. Variability was quite big for the individual species. So the big difference in the sole barley, the sole peas, and the sole beans. Lentils were actually a little bit closer together, and the lupins were quite variable. Actually, hares are quite partial to grazing lupins as well, and I think that's part of the reason that they did better in the 2019 year. Sorry, this is for the yield, the dry matter yield. Then we started looking at the percent of protein or crude protein in the different materials. So as you'd expect, the barley was towards the low end. Peas, beans, lupins, and lentils were all relatively high. Well, had the ability to be relatively high. Could be really, really high. Again, this very dry year, this yellow one. They just didn't really. They struggled to do well, but that's the kind of percent crude protein we were getting. What we didn't do in 2018, we didn't actually get them analysed for the beans because they had a tendency to go pretty black and manky, and we didn't want to do those samples. But the 2019 microsilage was much better, so we did those, and they're the figures we were getting. And you can see this general trend from a relatively high protein in the sole crop. And as you reduce the percentage of the protein crop in the mix, it moved down the way because it's been diluted by the barley component. And then if you multiply the 2 together, the yield and the protein content, you start looking at the protein yield. So again, you can see quite big differences between the 2018 and 19 for the peas and for the barley, for example. The beans, they're kind of dipping there in terms of the mix. So there's more barley in, there's a dip in terms of the crude protein yield. What surprised, the lupins never did particularly well, whether they're in a mix or not. But what we did find was that the lentils actually were pretty consistent. There was very little difference between the 2 years. So considering it's not really a Scottish crop, it actually performed probably the best in terms of consistency between years, which was quite pleasing to see and unexpected actually. This just gives us a little bit of information about some of the trace elements. So obviously that's can be quite important in terms of quality for the livestock that are eating the silage. Lupins were particularly good. We've got zinc, cobalt, copper, and sulfur. The lupins were particularly good at obtaining or having higher contents of all of those elements. Peas and beans were quite good in terms of copper, and the lentils were reasonable at most things. So in terms of the quality and sort of trace element content, that gives you an indication of what we're getting from those particular crops. And then there's a little bit here on digestibility. So the higher the grain content or of the grain protein, generally speaking, the higher the digestibility. And as you kind of move down, so there was a higher barley content, it tended to drop down, and that was fairly consistent between the different crops. And this here is a neutral detergent fiber, and it kind of went the opposite way. So basically it tended to be low when you had a higher grain protein content, and the more barley that was in, it went the other way around. So in terms of some conclusions for the silage, great potential to utilize more home protein sources based on historic evidence, but also some of the work that we've been doing. The intercropping cereals with the grain legumes can lead to more reliable production, and that was very clear for the lentils actually. In terms of protein yield, because when we had, for example, peas or beans, they either grew really, really well or pretty rubbish, whereas if we had the mix, they tended to kind of be somewhere in the middle, so there's a bit more stability between years. We're finding that in terms of protein, the 60% grain legume and 40% cereal of the seed rate was preferential. That's the one that tended to work. As I said before, the lentils performed much better than we anticipated. Lupins and lentils are really good accumulators of trace elements. The peas and beans of copper in particular, not so much the other ones. And in terms of sole crop grain legume silage, digestibility was good, better than the barley. The silage mixture tended to fall as the cereal inclusion was increased. And this relationship was reversed for the fiber. So if we quickly move to combined grain, this is some work that one of our students did actually, one of our master's students. This land equivalent ratio is something that John talked about briefly. This 1.2 basically means you've got a 20% higher yield, quite typically if you grow things in a mixture. And this here is growing the cereal. So we have barley as the yellow in this instance, barley on its own, or barley and pea. So we're getting roughly 20 to 30% improvement in terms of yield, grain yield. This was wheat and wheat pea. So the green is the pea, and this is the pea on its own. So you can see here, you're getting an improvement in terms of overall yield. And if we looked at the protein content, that again increased. Pea on its own obviously was the highest, but what we're trying to do is actually increase the protein yield overall on that area. And what we did do is actually raise the protein yield of the barley in the component of the mix as well. So that was one piece of work there that was done. Another piece of work done that myself and John did a few years ago was looking at grain yield of over 2 years actually. So these orange ones, we can ignore those for now, that's year 2. But in year 1, we've got either barley growing on its own, barley and clover, barley and pea, so this is the barley and the green's the pea, or we have oats and clover, oats and pea. We have clover on its own, so there's not much, there's no grain yield from that. We have pea on its own, or we have barley, and this is as conventional from Farm Management Handbook. So the yields we've got there, first year is kind of here. And then what we did, we've superimposed the second year. So we basically grew spring oats over the whole of each of these different plots and looked to see what had happened in terms of yield and quality. So this is actually 2 years worth of yield. So you can see the barley is pretty low. The one after the clover, it was basically just oats, was quite low. But when we started adding the mixes together, compared to just barley, the barley and clover, and then the oats, or the barley, pea, and the oats is much higher. And similarly with the oats, clover, and oats, pea. So you can see a yield improvement, particularly over 2 years. And if you convert that into some indication of gross margins, a 2-year gross margin. So this is the first year gross margin, this kind of yellow, this pre-crop effect. Obviously this is clover, so it's negative because we didn't actually crop it. And then we've got the follow on as well. And you start adding that. And as soon as you start getting these mixtures, either the barley and clover followed by the oats, or the barley pea followed by oats, your gross margins can start to actually improve quite significantly. And so again, I think John mentioned this in the terms of the rotational effect. We're really interested in that kind of carryover, not just looking at it in terms of 1 year. It's actually what can happen further down the rotation, because if you can improve your soil so it's more efficient, then hopefully the rest of the cropping, at least over the next few years, is going to benefit as well, and in terms of prices. So one of the things, just coming towards the end now, but one of the things was John mentioned about inoculum. Some grain legumes definitely need inoculum. These happens to be 2 fields of beans. Well, this is a field of weeds. It should be beans. This is in our organic rotation trial up at Craveston. This is in 1 year. We'd really struggled to get the beans to grow. They grew okay with a big seed, and then struggled, and we weren't getting any nodulation, which obviously is a key part for a legume to function properly. And then the following year, we actually used an inoculum, and we got a perfectly good bean crop. I think we got about 4.5 to 5 tons per hectare in that year. And we used that until we've gone through the full cycle of the rotation. And ever since then, the natural levels have built up, and we've not had any issues at all. So if you've not grown a legume, even if it's a pea or a bean, you may consider utilizing an inoculant just as a backup. It's not normally it's not normally a standard practice, but it might be worth considering if you've not grown these crops before. And that might be why people get such variable results, or have had variable results. So this, we did a little experiment to see why this might be happening. So looking at the effect of rhizobia inoculation on nodule numbers, so the little nitrogen fixing nodules on the roots of pot grown. So we basically got soil from these fields, the ones that hadn't had beans in them at that point in time, grew beans in the pots for 3 weeks, and we had 2 options. We had inoculation or no inoculation, and we had just a tiny amount of fertilizer, 20 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, or no nitrogen fertilizer. And the ones that were inoculated with no nitrogen fertilizer, after 3 weeks, we got 62 nodules per pot. The ones that had a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer but inoculation had about 1/3 of that. And the ones that had no inoculation were really, really low levels. And that's basically what we're finding in this half of the field on the left. So if there's nitrogen in the soil, you won't get so much nitrogen fixation, because there's no need for the plant to actually do that. If you've got fairly low levels, then you will kind of stimulate nitrogen fixation. So that's another thing worth knowing. If you're going to grow a legume in a highly nitrogen fertile soil, you're probably not going to see the benefit of lots of nitrogen fixation. So I mentioned Paul Hargreaves. We've got demonstrations now with some winter beans at both our Aberdeen and Dumfries locations, and we'll be putting some spring beans in shortly, mostly looking at a range of bean varieties, a few mixtures, and some intercrops with cereals. We're looking at carryover experiments, so some of the protein crop experiments that I showed earlier. We had some last year, and we're going to be growing spring barley with or without 60 kilos of nitrogen after those. We've also got the rotation trial, so I showed you the beans just before, with or without the inoculation there. So we've got a lot of grass and clover in those. It's basically a system trial. We've got the field beans, which we've just seen, but also we have a stockless system, which is using quite a lot of undersown white clover in the beans themselves, but also in all the cereals in that particular rotation, which is a 6-course rotation. And then we have some mixed herbal ley plots as well. And again, this is really looking at species mixtures. So not all of them are legumes, but we're looking at a range of species from 18 up to 18 species, from 3 species up to 18 species. So there's grasses, legumes, including clovers. So we've got some standard kind of mixtures, but we've also got some with a big range of herbs and forbs and that kind of thing. And we're looking at biomass and quality of that herbage, and also the impact it's having on the soil health using simple things like Vetch and worm counts and that kind of thing. So what does it all mean? Yield or land equivalent ratio of intercrops and mixtures can be quite impressive. So as we've said, you can typically get somewhere in the region of 20 to 30% in improvement in terms of yield in a mix. Yield on the following crop is really important, particularly in the low input system. So there is not only from the residual nitrogen, but you've also got a lot of this soil health improvements, which again, John spoke about as well. Impact on quality, so protein content, we saw some information there, and also in terms of trace element uptake. And obviously there's a potential for gross margin improvement, and not necessarily just looking at the year you're growing some of these crops, but really the impact it can be having down the line, this kind of legacy effect in terms of general improvements over the years. And these are the various people that I'd like to thank for helping to fund the work. And that's it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Robin. I will just I'll just bring my screen back up, and we will go to Q&A. Oh.
I can see one question. It's intercropping peas and barley. What are the sowing rates? So the peas, I think we're about 220 kilos per hectare as a full rate, and the barley was about 200 kilos per hectare as the full rate. So obviously 100%, that was 100% either or, and then it was the various ratios that we did between those, either the 60% of one and 40% and the other way around. But the one that we tended to find best was the 60% of the pea sowing rate and the 40% to the barley. And again, the barley does help a little bit like with the lentils. It does kind of help hold the peas up slightly as well. So there's a bit of a scaffold effect, which can help, particularly when it comes to reduced lodging.
John, do you have any comment on that question that's come in?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Do you have any comment on the question that's just come in there?
The seed rates?
Yeah.
Well, no, no, not really. I think, yeah, Robin's been doing those experiments most recently. We tend that there are two real approaches to seed rates for intercrops. So one is that you try and make the seed rate of the two components, assuming it's a 2-component mix, add up to a full seed rate. So typically something like half the seed rate for peas, half the seed rate for barley. So you end up with a full seed rate, if you like.
And that's what we did here as a replacement. That's known as, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's called a replacement design, where you're aiming for a full seed rate. But there's also additive designs where, much like the name suggests, you have maybe an 80% seed rate of cereal plus a 50% seed rate of pea. So you're effectively overseeding a bit.
Yeah.
But we only ever did replacement designs, and that's the most common sorted intercropping.
I mean, you've obviously got added seed costs if you start going above that as well, so that you kind of take that into account a little bit. But I mean, consistently, our 60% pea, 40% barley is worked really well. And so the one thing that the beans can work quite well, but the maturity is quite variable. The beans are really quite late, so you can end up losing a lot of the barley if you're not careful. So the peas and the barley definitely have a more a closer maturity window.
Oh, that's brilliant. We've got a few more questions here. We've got one from David Whiteford. I've seen the golf course in question. So he says, what would you recommend sowing on a golf course that I'm bringing back into farmland? It's not been farmed for 30 years, probably presumably apart from grazing of sheep in the last year, I think, since he's taken it over. pH is 5.2 to 5.4, so it's right low. It's light land. Can graze it or whole crop it. What would you suggest David should think about planting?
Well, think about liming to start with, but
definitely,
yeah. I would be a bit wary about growing peas at that lower rate, and actually even barley might be a bit tight, down towards 5.2. I mean, again, I mean, I don't know the soil analysis, but I don't know whether it was mapped or what have you, but if that's an average, then you could have pH much lower than that in certain parts of the field, which, I mean, we've got a pH rotation at Craveston, and you start looking at barley below pH 5.5, and it just drops off hugely. And even clover, there's white clover in there, white clover ley, that really struggles below pH 5.5 as well. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, have you got any thoughts, John, with some of the more unusual things? I mean, what's vetch like in a low pH?
Well, yeah, I mean, so some legumes are okay-ish growing at lower pHs. Not many though. The trefoils definitely better at low pH than most of the other things. But yeah, I think anything, I think, as Robin said, to get the pH up a bit, and if it's light, especially if it's light land as well, try and just concentrate on building up some organic matter. And that's going to be quite a good first step.
Absolutely. I mean, do we think there'll be problems there with compaction as well? If he's looking for more, introducing more of a ley for grazing of animals, should he think about maybe different multi-species kind of herbs, or what would you recommend on that front?
Well, possibly. I mean, the multi-species. I mean, if you've got things like chicory and things like that, I mean, one of the reasons for us having those, well, you could see the chicory in one of the pictures I showed, was to try and get that big taproot to start breaking down into the, through any sort of compacted areas. That's one of the reasons for having those kind of things. And there's you can get all sorts of weird and wonderful crops. You get like sort of kind of radish type things, which again are supposed to kind of break the crops. I mean, Cotswold Seeds Webs have got a fantastic demonstration of pictures of how the different components of a green manure can work, and yeah, and again, I don't know what is it. If it's a golf course, is it quite sand? Has there been a lot of sand added? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what the soil texture is, because that might have some influence.
It says it's light land. But yeah, I would be very tempted to go for something with quite a wide mix of different species to get that variation in root structure. You want some kind of fairly shallow, very fibrous rooting material to start kicking off that organic matter accumulation. but also some of the bigger deep-rooted herbs. So some of these things with big tap roots that are going to punch on down and start helping recirculate nutrients and that sort of thing. If nothing's happened to it much for 30 years, then I think sort of trying to reactivate the soil profile in a way is probably a good thing to do.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. It's two great answers. Someone's looking just for clarification that all the different types of lupins and lentils are safe to feed to cattle and sheep. Is there anything to consider on that front?
I'm not 100% sure actually, because our results are from trials, and we didn't feed them to. I mean, we fed some of the beans and peas to. I think you've got another one of these webinars in. I think you've got Jos Huddink, who's a monogastric specialist at SRUC. So some of the trial material that we produced off these trials he used in some of his feeding trials, but it was the beans and peas he used, not the lupins or lentils. So the only data we've got is actually from the lab analysis.
Just on that point, I will say I was going to wait until the end, but I might as well say now that this is, and some of you will have heard at the very start, this is part one of a two-part series. So we are going to look at nutrition and feeding legumes in part two, which is scheduled to come out in June. So just watch that space, and that is something that we'll cover.
Yeah, I mean, the trials that we had, I mean, the majority of these are kind of plot based, so the plot lengths are maybe 12 meters by 2 meters. So we didn't have feeding, there wasn't a feeding component to it, apart from, as I said, the peas and the beans, which were used in some chicken trials with Jos. So I can't really comment too much on that one beyond that.
No, that's great. I certainly remember from my uni days a few years ago, lupins were getting touted as an alternative solution to soya. I'm not sure if it depends on the varieties in terms of suitability for livestock feeding or not. We've got another question here.
I was going to say, there's a thing off that. There's a thing called lupicalage, which it's been marketed. So I mean, that's certainly been grown, as far as I'm aware, down in the southwest. So it's lupins and triticale as a mix. I think for silage, I'm not sure. So I'm suspecting the lupin side, there shouldn't be a problem. Lentils, I don't know. So we didn't grow enough of them to be able to say, but I'd be surprised if there was an issue.
Yep, no, that's great. We've got a question on inoculating. Can you explain more about what you mean by inoculating the pea or bean crop for the first time? I was also wondering, how do you actually go about this inoculation? Is it all seed treatments? Can you spray it on, or how does that all work?
It depends. In terms, I think Robin's thing was quite interesting in that we needed to inoculate beans. Most people would assume you don't really need to inoculate beans, and I think most of the time you probably don't. But as he said, I think if you're growing them for the first time and there's no kind of recent history of having grown them, it's worth maybe the year before you grow them, getting a few seeds and just sticking them in the corner of a field and then digging them up and seeing if they have nodules on the roots. It is fairly easy to see if they're getting nodulated or not. But it's the more exotic ones that are more of an issue. So the two that are really flagged up are lupins and Lucerne. But as I say, when you buy those, certainly whenever we've bought them, it's made very obvious that you need to inoculate them, and they're sold together with the inoculum. And there's two ways that can happen. I've had both in the last few years I've had two forms for Lucerne. So the two options are that the inoculum comes in essentially a fine peat sort of mixture, sealed in a bag that you just keep in the fridge. And then when you're ready to sow, you just sort of scatter it into the hopper with the seeds. and it goes down the cooters with the seed. So that's fairly straightforward. Or even more straightforward is the seed's just coated when it arrives. So it's just a seed coating that's applied already. And all the lupins I've grown have been supplied coated. So there really isn't an issue. But those are the two methods I'm aware of. So either seed coating or just a bag that gets scattered in at sowing time. So it's pretty straightforward. It's nothing to worry about, as long as you remember to do it.
That's great. It's interesting. We've still got a few more questions, which is great. Someone has asked, you say red clover is not the best for grazing. With that in mind, would you include it in a herbal ley?
It is included in herbal leys that are intended for grazing. I think it partly depends what you're going to graze with.
Yeah, sheep will knock it.
Sheep really knock it because they've got that very small muzzle that nibbles down to kind of about 2-3 centimeters, and they'll really knock the growing points out. Whereas cattle, which are grazing maybe 10-12 centimeters, something like that, and are much kind of coarser anyway, sort of ripping up clumps with their tongue, it won't do as much damage. And red clover does bring some valuable things to the party, so I certainly wouldn't discount it. And I know, as I said, it is sold in herbal leys, so yeah, I wouldn't automatically discount it. I mean, unless you're planning on grazing it with sheep.
Part of it's persistence, isn't it, as well? So it'll probably be okay for a couple of years, but if you're grazing it, it'll probably knock it out a bit faster.
Yeah, there's also the phytoestrogen issue as well with red clover and grazing that you just need to be aware of.
Yep, absolutely. And also maybe in terms of how you manage it in terms of rotational grazing, or how much rest period you give it between grazing so it can actually recover. I think you could fairly knock that red clover out, couldn't you, in a year or two. In terms of sowing depth of mixed crops, this is a companion question to a previous question. Someone's mentioned though that the whole crop yields look very high, comparable to hybrid rye autumn sowing. Is that right, as harvested grain yields are moderate or modest? Mixed legumes actually ferment in the silage okay? It's kind of a two-part question there.
So is the rye bit to John, maybe? I'm not sure actually.
Who fancies taking that one?
I'm not sure whether that's a bit to either of us actually, because there's a bit there about the hybrid rye, and John was talking about the rye vetch.
I briefly mentioned rye vetch, but I didn't really. I do have a whole load of data on it, but I didn't present it. But this is on about whole crop yields, so that's maybe your silage yields, Robin.
Yeah, no, I mean, they seem to ferment okay. What we had in the silage, it didn't seem to have an issue with the mixed legumes and the if that's what you mean anyway, whether it's the various grain legumes and barley, it seemed to ferment okay.
Yeah, we've tended to add
an additive.
We tend to add sugar, just because the legumes, because of their high nitrogen content, and have nothing like as high a sugar level as things like ryegrass. So we do tend to use sugar as an additive, but that's quite common with legume silages.
So I don't know whether that's answered.
The sowing depth of mixed crops is, it's an interesting one when you get very different seed sizes. So, pea cereal mixes aren't so much.
Yeah, normally go for about 3 centimeters for those. Normally 3 or 4 centimeters.
Whereas the cereal bean ones are a bit more of an issue, because the bean, if you've got a big bean, and particularly if you're trying one with winter beans where you might have 1,000 seed weight over 600 or something. That can be a bit of an issue.
I mean, the other thing, I guess, is if you've got sort of grain. I mean, some of the mixes we've had grain legumes, and then we've had clover as well, and they're very different in terms of seed size.
Yeah, you can. It depends what kind of kit you've got. It can need a bit of fiddling around with the kit to get the seed sown, and you just have to kind of go for a generally shallower than you would want maybe for some of the big seeds, because they'll still do okay. Whereas if you stick clover down at 4 centimeters, you know it's going to struggle.
You might have the option of broadcasting it at the same time, you know, so you can the smaller stuff.
Yeah, and another thing that I know some people do is they rig up a twin hopper system and feed alternate coulters with different with different seeds. So it's obviously a bit more hardcore that, but it is done. And so you can sow at 2 different depths on the same pass.
Okay, brilliant. We've kind of got one final question. I suppose this is maybe for Robin in terms of the trials you've been involved in. It's a question on sort of cultivation. How have you established these mixed crops that you've grown in terms of, is it going to the usual firm bare soil seed bed?
Yeah.
Or are you min-tilling, or are you trialing direct drilling?
It's not min-till or direct drill. It's basically ploughed and cultivated. So yeah, pretty, you know, old school.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason for that is because it is a trial, and you know, it's a bit like things like putting on the basal P and K. It's just to remove some of those things that might affect your results. Whereas it might not necessarily be something you did actually in practice. So yeah, I mean, there are, well, there's even now specific mixes sold for direct drilling, you know, with species in that will establish really well in those kind of conditions. But yeah, it certainly can be done. It's just that in a kind of a trial environment, you want to remove as many of the variables as you can. And it's, yeah, that's one of the main reasons. It's not because you can't.
Well, people
direct
do.
drill.
People do.
Yeah.
Daniel, I see we've got some messages in the chat there. Can you just check them and see that there are no other questions?
Absolutely. We've got one question about sandvine. How far will it grow? Can you grow it in the north of Scotland?
Right. As I say, I think we were struggling in Aberdeen. It's a combination of warmth, wetness, and pH, really. I mean, if you're on a pocket of fairly high pH soil, you know, which is possible. I mean, the limestone outcrops right up on the north coast. You could maybe try it, but I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope if you're on a kind of typical sort of fairly wet, fairly acid sort of soil. It just really doesn't do well at all in our experience.
Is that a 1-year crop or something that you get a few years out of?
Sandvine,
generally in good conditions.
It can be in for a long time. You know, sort of 5-8 years, that kind of thing. You know, as I said, for hundreds of years, it sort of powered agriculture across the whole south of England. And I think I saw a statistic in the early 80s, there was 2 tons of seed produced in the whole of the UK for sunflower. You know, it had almost disappeared. It was that bad. But no, it's a great crop, but just not for you know, typical Scottish conditions. That not to say you couldn't be in a little pocket where you might just get away with it, but yeah, I'd try other things first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, dead on. We've I think it's a similar story with a lot of these mixed species swards. There's a lot of options. You just got to try and find the ones that work in your local area. We've got maybe one final question before we wrap up for the night. It's a fairly long one. We've got Becky here. She says, we are really keen this year to sow a legume mixture on existing permanent pasture, brackets once the soil temperature comes up, and then mob graze this mixture with cattle. Any mixtures you'd recommend for cattle in terms of nutritional value, and also to add value to the soil if it's trampled in. They prefer not to plough it, or what would you recommend the seed bed to be ploughed, or is it okay to direct drill into the permanent pasture once cows have been through with their hooves? So could you grade it hard and look at direct drilling? What kind of mixture would you recommend?
I mean, again, I think having an indication of some kind of soil analysis would be quite useful to get an idea of what may or may not survive. And there's quite a lot of options being asked there. So I don't know, it's $1 million question, isn't it? A really tricky one. I mean, that's actually where one of these really diverse mixes might come in handy, because something is likely to at least work out of that. You know, as John talked about, there's a redundancy effect in some of these really broad scale mixes.
Yeah. I mean, not wanting to particularly endorse them, but and not wanting to not endorse them either. They're a fine enough company. Cotswold Seeds, I think from memory, do a deep rooting herbal ley mix, which is very diverse and also is suitable for direct drilling and oversowing. So it might be worth looking that up, or getting in touch with them and asking them about that, what they think. Is that suitable for your situation? I think from memory, it would potentially be quite good, but you would need to check that one out. But that's one of these very diverse mixes, as Robin said. So it's got, I think it's kind of about 60% legume. So it's got quite a lot of clovers in it, and a few of the more exotics, and then quite a mix of herbs, particularly some of these bigger ones,
plantains and chicory,
things like that, yeah, to get deep roots down. So it might be, I think it would be worth your while getting in touch with them and certainly looking into that. I'm sure other seed merchants sell similar type mixes as well, though.
Brilliant. Any last minute questions, Daniel? Nothing else?
No, I think we're good to go, Alec.
Fantastic. Well, I can see, is there just one coming into the chat there?
Oh no, so thank you. That's good.
Oh, good stuff. That's perfect. So yeah, apologies, folks. I know that we've gone a bit long this evening, but I'd just like to thank you for coming along. I thought that some of the discussion points were really good. I'm never afraid to let a meeting drag on if the discussion is good. So thanks very much to Robin and to John for I hope you've all got an awful lot from it. Thanks to Daniel Stout for helping out with the questions, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Like I said, this is part one of a two-part series, so anybody who has any interest in looking at nutrition and feeding legumes, check back with us in June. So I'll just call the meeting to a close, but thank you very much on behalf of the Farm Advisory Service. Have a good night.